She was taken from her homeland as a slave. Yet within the walls of the Ottoman palace, she would rise higher than anyone could ever imagine. This is the story of Hurrem Sultan, the woman who changed an empire forever. Imagine this, a young woman torn from her homeland, stripped of her freedom, and sold into slavery. For most, this would be the end of their story, a life of quiet suffering, forgotten by history. But not for her. Against every odd, this woman would rise from the chains of captivity to sit beside the most powerful man in the world. She would become his trusted partner, his confidant, and, most shockingly, his legal wife, shattering a tradition that had stood unbroken for centuries. Her name was Hurrem Sultan. Now take a moment and think about the world she stepped into. The year is the early 1500s. The Ottoman Empire stretches across 3 continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Its armies are feared, its wealth unmatched, and at the very heart of this empire sits one man, Suleiman the Magnificent. He was not just a ruler, he was the lawmaker, the military commander, and in many ways the living symbol of the empire's glory. To defy tradition under such a ruler was unthinkable, and yet one woman dared to change everything. You see, the Ottoman sultans followed strict customs, especially when it came to women. For centuries they avoided official marriage, keeping their relationships within the palace harem. Why? Because marriage created alliances, and alliances created obligations. The empire could not risk being tied to one powerful family or foreign power, so instead concubines bore their heirs, and once a prince grew up, his mother would leave the palace with him to govern distant provinces. It was a system designed to prevent women from holding too much influence at court. But then came Hurrem, a woman who would tear that rulebook to pieces. Think about the courage it must have taken. A young slave girl brought into the palace with no name, no protection, no future of her own, suddenly finding herself in the gaze of Suleiman himself. What could she have done to stand out in a palace filled with beauty, talent, and ambition? Some accounts say it was her laughter, that she radiated joy in a place of strict etiquette and silence. Others point to her intelligence, her wit, her ability to carry conversations that went far beyond flattery. Whatever it was, she captured the heart of a man who could have chosen anyone, and that single connection would reshape the destiny of an empire. And here's the remarkable part. Suleiman did not just keep her as his favorite, he did the unthinkable. He freed her and married her legally. This was not a quiet affair, not a private arrangement behind palace walls. This was an official union, declared openly, as if Suleiman wanted the world to know. Hurrem was not just his concubine, she was his wife, his equal in name, if not in power. Imagine the shock across the empire. Imagine the whispers among the courtiers who had served under generations of sultans who never dared such a move. It was as if Suleiman himself had said, "Tradition ends here." So why does this matter? Because Hurrem's story is not just about a love affair, it's about power, about resilience, about rewriting the rules of a world designed to keep her silent. She went from being a nameless slave to becoming the first legal wife of an Ottoman sultan in over 200 years. And with that marriage, she opened the door to something greater: influence, real, undeniable, political power. Now ask yourself, what would you do if you were given that chance? If life had thrown every obstacle your way, stripped you of freedom, identity, even dignity, would you dare to rise above it? Would you dare to leave your mark on history? Because Hurrem did. She stepped into a world that told her she was nothing, and she left it as one of the most powerful women of her time. And this is only the beginning of her story.
To truly understand Hurrem Sultan's extraordinary rise, we have to start at the very beginning, long before the palaces, the power, and the glitter of empire. Because before she was Hurrem, she was simply a young girl named Alexandra Lasowska, born around 1502 in a quiet corner of Ruthenia, what we now know as Western Ukraine. Picture it: rolling hills, small villages, wooden churches, and a childhood rooted in faith and simplicity. Some sources say her father was a priest. Others suggest she grew up in a modest family, far removed from the intrigues of palaces and politics. By all accounts, she was not destined for greatness. She was just a girl, like countless others across Europe, who could never have imagined the twists fate had prepared for her. And then, everything changed. One fateful day, her village was attacked by Crimean Tatar raiders. For the people of Ruthenia, these raids were a terrifying reality. Armed horsemen swept through villages, burning homes, capturing men, women, and children, then selling them into slavery. Alexandra, barely a teenager, was among the captives. Imagine the fear, the panic of being torn away from her family, not knowing if she would ever see them again. She was marched hundreds of miles south, through harsh terrain, until finally reaching the bustling slave markets of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast. Here, human lives were bartered like goods, and among the traders, one group stood out: Ottoman buyers, always on the lookout for young women who could be trained for the imperial harem in Istanbul. And that is where Alexandra's second life began. Now let's pause for a moment and picture this world. The harem wasn't simply what Hollywood often imagines, a place of idle beauty and luxury. No, the imperial harem was a political institution, a carefully structured environment where young women were educated, disciplined, and, if they were lucky, selected to serve the Sultan himself. It was as much a school of survival as it was a palace. Here, Alexandra was given a new name, Hurrem, meaning the joyful one. Names had power, and this one fit her perfectly. She was trained in languages, music, embroidery, poetry, and etiquette. She learned to read people, to hold herself with grace, to turn charm into influence. The harem was ruthless, competition was fierce, and mistakes could cost you your life. But Hurrem wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Can you imagine the mindset it must have taken? Most captives would have broken under the weight of despair, longing only for freedom or revenge. But Hurrem seemed to understand something deeper, that if life had placed her inside this gilded cage, then she would master it. She would learn its rules, and then she would bend them. It wasn't long before her unique spark caught the attention of Prince Suleiman, the heir to the Ottoman throne. And here's the thing. In a palace filled with women of striking beauty, it wasn't just looks that mattered. It was presence. It was intelligence. It was the ability to captivate not only the eye, but also the mind and the heart. Some say Hurrem was playful, that she laughed easily in a place where laughter was rare. Others say she had a sharp wit, able to converse with Suleiman on topics far beyond the expected. Whatever the truth, one fact is clear. She had something no one else did. And Suleiman noticed. From that moment, her life would never be the same again. The young slave girl, stolen from her village, was now at the center of the most powerful empire on earth. But as we'll see, rising in the harem was only the first step. The real test was yet to come. Because every step upward meant new enemies, dangerous rivals, and risks that could end her life at any moment. Hurrem had entered the stage of history, and she wasn't planning to leave quietly. When Hurrem entered the harem, she was just one girl among hundreds. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of young women from across the empire and beyond, each hoping for a chance to rise, each dreaming of being noticed by the prince who might one day rule the world. For most, that chance never came. They lived and died within those palace walls, remembered by no one. But Hurrem, she was different. Even before Suleiman ascended to the throne, before he was known as the Magnificent, he noticed her. In a world where beauty was common, what truly set her apart was not just her appearance, but her spirit. She was bold, she was intelligent, she dared to laugh openly, freely, in a place where silence and restraint were considered virtues. Imagine the shock of hearing laughter echo through the halls of the harem, and then realizing it came from a slave girl who had every reason to be broken. Instead, she radiated life. That's how she earned her new name, Hurrem, the joyful one. And it wasn't just a name, it was her identity. She brought energy into the cold formality of palace life. She could engage Suleiman in conversations that reached beyond the surface. While others might flatter him with shallow praise, Hurrem challenged his mind. She discussed poetry, politics, philosophy. She knew when to be playful, when to be serious, and most importantly, when to simply listen. This is an important lesson, isn't it? In life, it's rarely just about being the most talented or the most beautiful. It's about presence. It's about the energy you bring into a room, the way you make someone feel when they're with you. Hurrem mastered that art, and slowly, she began to eclipse Mahidevran, Suleiman's established consort and the mother of his eldest son. Mahidevran had long enjoyed her position as the prince's favorite, but Hurrem's arrival changed everything. Rivalries in the harem weren't just whispers or side glances. They could be brutal, even deadly. Allegiances shifted, gossip spread, and tension simmered beneath the surface. But Hurrem didn't shrink away from it. She leaned into it, proving she wasn't just another concubine. She was a force to be reckoned with. Suleiman's affection for her only grew. The palace began to notice how often he visited her chambers, how he would seek her counsel, how he smiled more in her presence. Can you imagine the envy this must have stirred? For Mahidevran, it was more than jealousy. It was the erosion of her influence, her security, even her son's future. And for Hurrem, every step upward came with the risk of making powerful enemies. But here's the remarkable part. She didn't rise by accident. She rose because she understood something fundamental. Relationships are about more than attraction. They're about connection. Suleiman didn't just see Hurrem as a companion. He saw her as someone who could stand beside him, someone he trusted, someone who made him feel understood. In a court filled with formality and flattery, Hurrem was genuine, and that made her unforgettable. Let's pause and think. How often in history do we see people break through barriers, not because they had the most resources, but because they carried themselves with authenticity, courage, and intelligence? Hurrem's rise in the harem wasn't just luck. It was the result of resilience, of refusing to let circumstances define her. By the time Suleiman became sultan in 1520, Hurrem's position was already strong. She wasn't just another voice in the harem. She was the voice he listened to most. And soon, she would achieve something no woman in the empire had dared before. She would become his legal wife, a move that would shake the foundations of Ottoman tradition. But for now, in those early years, her laughter, her wit, and her fearless charm carried her from the shadows of slavery into the very center of imperial power. The girl who had once been forgotten in a village raid was now unforgettable. And this was only the beginning. When Suleiman ascended to the throne in 1520, the world changed, not only for the empire, but for Hurrem. Suddenly, the man she had captured with laughter and conversation was no longer just a prince. He was the Sultan, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, and with his rise, her place in the palace became more secure than ever. Now, here's where things take an extraordinary turn, because Suleiman didn't just keep Hurrem as his favorite consort. He did something no Ottoman ruler had dared to do in over 200 years. He freed her, and then he married her. To truly grasp how shocking this was, we need to understand the tradition. For centuries, Ottoman sultans never married officially. Why? Because marriage meant alliances, and alliances meant obligations. If a sultan married the daughter of a noble family, that family could gain influence over the empire. By avoiding marriage, the sultans protected themselves from outside power struggles. Instead, they kept concubines in the harem, raised heirs with them, and when those heirs grew, the mothers and sons were sent away to govern distant provinces. It was a system designed to keep the throne untangled from external politics. But Suleiman tore that system apart. Imagine the scene, the court, the advisors, the entire empire buzzing with whispers. The sultan married a slave? He married his concubine? It was unthinkable. The harem, once a place of hidden arrangements, now became the center of scandal and controversy. Yet Suleiman didn't back down. He declared his love for Hurrem openly, elevating her not only above every woman in the palace, but above centuries of custom. Let's stop here and ask, why would a man with absolute power, who owed nothing to anyone, risk tradition for one woman? The answer is simple. He didn't see her as just anyone. Hurrem wasn't just a favorite. She was his partner. She offered him something deeper than beauty. She gave him companionship, counsel, and perhaps even a sense of joy and humanity in the midst of empire. And for that, he was willing to change history. Think of it this way. How many times have we seen leaders across history clinging desperately to tradition, too afraid to rock the boat? Suleiman did the opposite. He followed his heart, and by doing so, he shattered a rule that had stood for generations. Was it love? Was it her brilliance? Was it destiny? Maybe it was all three, but whatever the reason, Suleiman chose Hurrem, and in choosing her, he changed the course of Ottoman history forever. Of course, this decision didn't come without consequences. The court was divided. Some saw it as a dangerous break from the wisdom of the past. Others whispered that Hurrem must have bewitched him, that no ordinary woman could have so much influence. Even foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings in disbelief, writing about the slave girl who had become the Sultan's lawful wife. But Hurrem wasn't just any woman, and Suleiman knew it. She was now the first and only official wife of an Ottoman Sultan in over 200 years. And that title gave her more than just honor. It gave her power. She could now play a visible role not just in the palace, but in shaping the empire's future. Think about the symbolism of this marriage. A girl captured in a raid, sold into slavery, stripped of everything, now standing as the wife of the most powerful ruler alive. It's a story that forces us to ask, how much of our destiny is written, and how much do we carve for ourselves? Hurrem had no control over being taken from her home. She had no choice in being brought to the harem. But what she did once she was there, that was hers. She turned captivity into opportunity, silence into influence, and tradition into transformation. By breaking the rules, Suleiman and Hurrem together set the stage for a new era in Ottoman politics, an era where women would no longer remain in the shadows but step into the light of power. And Hurrem? She was just getting started. By the time Hurrem became Suleiman's official wife, her life had already defied every expectation. But what came next was even more remarkable. Because she didn't just enjoy her place at the Sultan's side, she used it. She stepped into a role no woman in Ottoman history had ever dared to claim, that of political partner, strategist, and advisor. Now let's be clear. The Ottoman court was not a place where women's voices were welcomed in matters of state. Decisions about war, law, and diplomacy were supposed to remain firmly in the hands of men. But Suleiman listened to Hurrem, and not in secret. He valued her insight openly. She wasn't just a wife who stayed behind palace walls. She became a partner whose influence stretched far beyond them. One of the most fascinating details is her political correspondence. Imagine this: letters written by a former slave girl, now the Sultan's wife, traveling across borders to reach the hands of kings and rulers. She wrote to the Polish king Sigismund II Augustus, maintaining a link with the land of her birth. She even corresponded with King Ferdinand I of the Habsburgs and King Francis I of France, two of Europe's most powerful monarchs. These weren't just casual greetings, they were diplomatic exchanges, carefully crafted to serve the empire's interests. Hurrem knew the power of words, and she used them to strengthen the Sultan's hand in the game of global politics. Think about what this meant in the 16th century. In an age when most women across Europe and Asia were excluded from statecraft, Hurrem was shaping international relations. She wasn't just surviving history, she was writing it. But her influence didn't stop at letters. She understood that the strength of an empire was built not only on conquests, but on alliances. And so she pushed for strategic marriages for her children. Her daughters, for instance, were married into powerful families across the empire, weaving a web of loyalty and support that extended Suleiman's reach. In this, Hurrem was playing a long game, one that wasn't about immediate glory, but about securing her family's place in the empire's future. And that's what makes her story so compelling. Because yes, she loved Suleiman, but she was also a realist. She knew that life in the palace was precarious, that rivals lurked in every corner, that fortunes could turn in an instant. By ensuring her children were married into positions of influence, she wasn't just protecting them. She was safeguarding the dynasty itself. Some people at court resented her for it. They accused her of meddling, of stepping too far into affairs that were not hers to touch. But others recognized her genius. They saw a woman who had the ear of the Sultan, and who used it not for vanity, but for vision. And here's where I want you to pause and reflect. How many times in history have we seen power wasted by those who had it handed to them? And yet here was Hurrem, a woman who started life with nothing, using every ounce of influence she gained not just for herself, but to reshape the future of an empire. Isn't there something inspiring about that? That even in a system designed to silence her, she refused to stay quiet? Suleiman himself trusted her deeply. Chronicles describe her as his confidant, his companion in both personal and political matters. Some historians even compare their partnership to a royal marriage of minds, where each decision, each plan, was discussed between them. Imagine the weight of that, when the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man alive, turned to his wife not just for comfort, but for counsel. This wasn't just love, this was partnership, and together, they redefined what it meant to rule. Hurrem Sultan's influence in politics and society wasn't a footnote, it was a revolution. She had taken her seat at the table of power, not by birthright, not by force, but by sheer intelligence, resilience, and courage. And in doing so, she lit the way for an entire era where women in the Ottoman court would no longer remain invisible. And as we'll see, that influence, so bold, so unprecedented, would spark rivalries, scandals, and dangerous plots that would test Hurrem's power like never before. Of course, with power comes resistance. And for Hurrem Sultan, the walls of the palace were filled with both allies and enemies. The higher she rose, the sharper the daggers pointed in her direction. From the very beginning, Hurrem faced two powerful rivals inside the palace. The first was Valid Sultan Hafsa, Suleiman's mother. As the queen mother, Hafsa was the most respected woman in the empire, the guardian of tradition, the embodiment of the old ways. And to her, Hurrem was a disruption, an outsider who had turned centuries of custom upside down. The second rival was even more personal. Mahidevran, Suleiman's former favorite and the mother of his eldest son, Shehzadeh Mustafa. Imagine the tension. Mahidevran had once held the position Hurrem now claimed. She had given the Sultan a son, an heir beloved not just by Suleiman, but by much of the empire. And suddenly, she was overshadowed by this new woman, who seemed to wield influence far beyond what a consort should. Inside the harem, whispers grew. Courtiers accused Hurrem of manipulating Suleiman, of using her wit and charm, not just to win his love, but to eliminate her rivals. Some believed every decision Suleiman made, whether in the palace or on the battlefield, was influenced by Hurrem's voice behind closed doors. And in the brutal world of imperial politics, perception was everything. The rivalry with Mahidevran soon escalated into open hostility. Stories tell of violent quarrels, even physical altercations between the two women. Mahidevran, once secure in her position, now saw her son's future slipping away as Hurrem's children rose higher in the line of succession. Every smile Hurrem shared with Suleiman, every moment of attention he gave her, was a reminder to Mahidevran that her influence was fading. But nothing would shake the empire more than the tragedy that unfolded in 1553. Shehzadeh Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son, strong, charismatic, and deeply admired by both the army and the people, stood as the most likely heir to the throne. Many saw him as the natural successor, the future of the empire. But others, especially those loyal to Hurrem, worried that Mustafa's rise would mean doom for her own sons. That year, while Suleiman was on campaign in Anatolia, rumors reached him that Mustafa was plotting to overthrow him. The accusations were deadly, painting the prince as a traitor hungry for his father's throne. And in one of the most controversial decisions of his reign, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's execution. The scene was heartbreaking. The beloved prince, strangled by the Sultan's guards inside his own tent, while the army outside wept in disbelief. This moment shook the empire to its core. How could a father kill his own son? And more importantly, who had whispered in his ear to make it happen? Many believed it was Hurrem. To her enemies, this was the ultimate proof of her manipulation, that she had orchestrated Mustafa's downfall to secure the future of her own children. Whether she truly played a direct role, we may never know. Historians still debate it. Some argue that Suleiman acted out of paranoia and fear, independent of Hurrem's influence. Others insist her hand is impossible to deny. But regardless of the truth, the perception stuck. Hurrem became the shadowy figure behind one of the darkest chapters of Suleiman's reign. To some, she was a cunning mastermind who destroyed rivals without mercy. To others, she was a mother protecting her children in a system where survival was never guaranteed. And here's the question we're left with. What would you have done in her place? If you were a woman in a world where power was fragile, where your children's lives depended on your ability to outmaneuver rivals, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have fought, even if it meant being remembered as ruthless. That's the paradox of Hurrem Sultan. She was loved and hated, admired and feared. To her supporters, she was a visionary who reshaped the empire. To her enemies, she was the woman who brought blood into the Sultan's own house. And in that tension, in that constant battle between power and survival, her legend only grew. Because if Hurrem proved anything, it's this: history doesn't always belong to the kind or the gentle. Sometimes it belongs to those who dare to seize it, no matter the cost. It's easy to remember Hurrem Sultan only for the rivalries, the scandals, and the whispers of intrigue. But that would be only half the story. Because beyond the palace walls, beyond the politics, Hurrem carved out a legacy of compassion that still echoes across centuries. You see, Hurrem understood something powerful. Influence means nothing if it doesn't leave a mark on the world. And so, while others schemed for temporary power, she looked outward. She became a patron of public works, channeling her wealth and position into projects that touch the lives of ordinary people. Take a walk through Istanbul even today, and you'll find traces of her vision. She funded mosques that became centers of faith and community. She built schools where children could learn, hospitals where the sick could find care, and public baths that gave dignity and relief to the poor. To a woman who had once been sold as a slave, perhaps the act of giving back, of creating spaces where others could find safety and hope, was her way of rewriting her own story. But Hurrem's generosity didn't stop at Istanbul. She extended her hand to the wider Islamic world. In Jerusalem, she financed a public soup kitchen that fed the hungry, regardless of status or background. In Mecca, the holiest of cities, she funded projects that served pilgrims who came from across the empire. Imagine that, a woman once powerless, now shaping the sacred landscapes of her faith. Her most famous project, however, was the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement. The complex included a mosque for worship, a hospital for the ill, and a soup kitchen that served food daily to the poor. It was a vision of leadership rooted not in fear or manipulation, but in service. And it carried her name, Haseki Hurrem Sultan. In a world where women were often erased from history, she inscribed herself into stone. Now let's pause and reflect. Isn't this the true test of power? Not how loudly people fear you in your lifetime, but how kindly they remember you after you're gone. While court enemies painted Hurrem as ruthless, the people of Istanbul saw her as a benefactor, a woman who used her influence to ease their burdens. Hurrem's life ended in 1558, years before Suleiman himself would die. But even in death, she remained by his side. She was buried in the courtyard of the Suleymaniye Mosque, the grand imperial mosque built by Suleiman, and there, their tombs still rest together, a powerful symbol of a partnership that defied tradition, scandal, and time itself. Think about what that means. In the Ottoman world, few consorts were granted such honor, but Hurrem was not like any other. The slave girl who had entered the palace in chains was now immortalized beside the Sultan, her name spoken with reverence. Her deeds carved into the very fabric of the city. So what is Hurrem Sultan's legacy? Was she a cunning manipulator who tore families apart for her own gain? Or was she a visionary woman who broke barriers, rewrote the rules, and used her influence to serve the people? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps her story reminds us that history is rarely simple, and power is never clean. But one thing is certain: Hurrem's life forces us to ask uncomfortable but important questions. What does it mean to rise above the limits placed on you? How do you balance ambition with compassion? And in the end, what do you want your legacy to be? Fear or remembrance? Hurrem chose remembrance, and that is why, centuries later, her name is still spoken, her buildings still stand, and her story still inspires. From slave to sultana, from captive to queen, Hurrem Sultan proved that destiny is not always written for us. Sometimes, we write it ourselves. And so, as we close this chapter of history, we look back at Hurrem Sultan's extraordinary journey. A girl who began her life in chains, stolen from her homeland, entered the palace as a nameless concubine. Yet she rose, step by step, against every obstacle, against every tradition, to become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, and one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. Her story redefined what it meant to be a woman in the empire. before Hurrem, the harem was meant to be a place of silence, a gilded cage where women remained unseen and unheard. After Hurrem, it became a place of power. She shattered the idea that women had no role in shaping the future of the state, and in doing so, she lit the spark for what historians now call the Sultanate of Women, a century-long era when imperial wives and mothers held unprecedented sway over politics, diplomacy, and dynastic succession. But here's the thing about Hurrem: her legacy is not neat and simple. It's complex, filled with triumphs and controversies. To some, she was ruthless, accused of scheming and manipulating her way into power, even influencing the execution of rivals. To others, she was a visionary, a survivor who used her brilliance and determination to protect her children, strengthen the empire, and leave behind institutions that served ordinary people for generations. And maybe that's the point. Hurrem's story reminds us that greatness is rarely clean, and power is never innocent. History doesn't remember her as a saint, but as a force, one who refused to be defined by her circumstances. Think about it. How many of us have felt trapped at some point in life? Maybe not in chains, but in expectations, in limitations, in roles the world has written for us. Hurrem shows us that those roles can be broken, that even when the odds are stacked against you, you can carve your own destiny. She teaches us that resilience, intelligence, and courage can turn captivity into influence, and influence into legacy. Her monuments still stand, her name is still spoken, and her story is still told, not just in Turkey, not just in history books, but across the world, because Hurrem Sultan embodies a truth that resonates far beyond her own time, that a single life, no matter how unlikely, can reshape the destiny of an empire. So when we look back at her journey, what do we see? A slave? A manipulator? A queen? Or perhaps all three, woven together into a story that is as human as it is legendary. And maybe that's why she fascinates us even today, because her life forces us to confront the messy, complicated, but deeply inspiring truth of what it means to seize power and leave a mark. Hurrem Sultan lived, loved, fought, and built. She left behind not only intrigue and scandal, but also schools, hospitals, mosques, and hope for countless people she would never meet. She proved that even in the most rigid systems, even in the harshest conditions, change is possible. And that, perhaps, is her greatest legacy. Not just the story of a woman who became a sultana, but the story of what it means to rise above every limitation, to claim your place in history, and to leave behind something that lasts. Hurrem Sultan, controversial, brilliant, resilient, was more than a queen. She was a revolution,